Stop. Just stop. I know you got to this video because you typed in Db2 REORG example. The command is very, very simple. It will take me all of 30 seconds to explain how to do it syntactically. The problem is you have to know how to handle a reorg, especially on a large table the very first time, or a large table that's just had a lot of change. If you're not careful how you approach it, you can run into various problems, from locking your application out while you're doing work, to blowing out your file systems, to generating so many logs that you don't know what to do with them, but you have to keep them for recovery. So you have to be careful. I'm not saying this to scare you. Reorgs are needed. Matter of fact, I do them weekly just to help my database performance along. They may be needed because you have to do database compression and need to regenerate your compression dictionary. Maybe you have a long-standing table and you killed off a column, so you have to do a reorg. Or most people do it because they want a contiguous area of data at the front of the disk with all its empty space at the end. It's essentially a disk defrag. And if you don't do this every once in a while, it will slow your performance down and it will cause you to balloon on the space that you need. I have a database that really needs to be reorged, and I know that once it's done, it's going to shrink by about half. And I know that my backup time is going to shrink by half. But the business has caused me to wait. I wasn't able to start doing reorgs early and often. I'm doing it very late and I have to do it in one time. So I have to change my approach. So let's go over into the presentation, and I'm going to show you what to watch for. Yes, this video is going to be a little long. Bear with it. You're going to need to understand the background. If you really want to move around, go to the timestamps in the show notes. They'll get you to where you want to go. We're going to tackle reorg from multiple different perspectives. We're going to talk about the two types and the advantages and disadvantages to each, how we go about doing it, monitor it, and how do we handle things if we have to abort. Let's start with the original, the classic reorg. When you're doing a offline or classic reorg, there are advantages and disadvantages. The first two are really a good advantage. It's fast. It's much faster, especially if lobs are not involved. And you don't have to go into a second phase for indexes. It's done automatically for you at the end. But the biggest drawback, and what makes most of the business units scream and run away, is because you could run into limited access when you are running with a reorg. There's a phase where it lets you have access. There's a phase where it's going to try to lock you out. And if you have a 24/7 highly transactional processing database, you're going to run into issues here. The other disadvantages are you really can't stop. Once you are committed, you are committed. And it can also consume a lot of space, but I'll cover that in a minute. So what actually happens when I kick this off? These phases are important to know because as you're monitoring, you can see what phase you are rolling into if you're doing it the right way. The first thing that happens, but not always, is the sort phase. If your table is dealing with a clustered index, we're going to start here, where it's going to start ordering the rows for you ahead of time. Most of the time, we're starting at the build phase, where an entire reorganized copy is built in either the table space your table exists in, or a temporary table space if you specify it. This is where you can get in trouble. If you have a small 10 meg table, building a copy is not a big deal. If you have a 100 gig table, building a duplicate copy is a big deal. And it can take time, and you've got to watch to make sure you have the space requirements to do so. During the build phase, though, you still have read access. Once this is done, it goes into the replace phase, when it takes your newly reorganized copy and overwrites the original with it. This is when exclusive access is needed by DB2, and this is where contention can happen. So in the old days, you really didn't have a choice. You were negotiating a maintenance window with the business unit with the understanding that when this happens, they probably have access a large part of the time, but sometimes they will not. And that's changed now with the in-place reorg. And this is where the hang-up happens. The next thing that happens is the recreate index phase. After everything is copied back and your original is replaced, it's going to go back and totally rebuild your indexes on the new physical layout of where all your data is. So let's go to the newer version of reorg, the online or in-place reorg. There are a couple advantages here. The full table access, except during the truncate phase. And I'm going to talk about that when the what is happening phase gets here. But the truncate phase sometimes is elongated or very short, but for the most part you have full table access, and that is a huge advantage. You also have the ability to piecemeal this or start and stop it as it's doing work. If you are starting to bump up against where a big load is going to come in, go ahead and stop it until the load's done, and then you can pick it right back up. You also can see some of the immediate benefits even before it's completed, because it's actively moving stuff as opposed to a shadow copy. And you will start to see the benefits the further along it gets. The disadvantages, you can have imperfect clustering based off of your activity. I mean, you are basically doing work as everybody else is hitting it at a read and write. And you have to go into a separate phase to reorg your indexes, because that's where they're maintained. They're not reset after everything is done. The thing to watch out for here is you could potentially have huge logging requirements. Again, on a smaller table, this isn't a big deal, but let's talk from example here. I have a 100 gig table and I purged 50 gig of it. In my specific scenario, I am generating 1 gig logs at a time. I very rarely generate 1 log. And as a side note, no, I didn't choose that. Those requirements came down to me. But in this case, when I started to do my reorg and move things around, I was generating a 1 gig log a minute, and I had to be prepared to handle that in a couple different areas. So watch out here. What's happening? It works in phases. It's not going to go try to handle everything at one time. DB2 is going to try to go grab a group of rows to start the process, and it's going to move that group of rows somewhere else onto a free page of the table. And it's going to then copy them back in the best location in a reorganized format. And if you have more rows to grab, you're going to go back up to the select phase, or you'll end here if you take the no truncate switch and slap it on this command. If you are going to go ahead and truncate, then you go into the last phase. The free space that is now at the end of your table space, because you physically moved all your data into one lump at the very beginning, that can now be released back to the operating system. During the truncate phase, you could lock people out briefly. In my experience, I have online reorgs running every week based off of need in an automated fashion. And once in the past 3 years have I ever seen the truncate phase bump into a process and block it out. However, in those one-timers where this is 1 time a year, I can get the time to go and reorg a gigantic table. Yes, that truncate phase can take a few minutes or hold there for a little while. So be cautious. It usually has a lot to do with the size of your table and how much has to be moved back around. So I understand the difference between my offline and my online. How do I execute these? Well, the commands are ridiculously simple. You know, it's really simple commands, but you really have to watch when you run these things because you can lock some things up. The offline is pretty easy, reorg table and the table name. If you want to specify a temporary table space, you slap that on the end. Otherwise, it'll be in the table space of the table that you're working on. The in-place reorg is almost identical. You're going to put in place allow write access. And if you need to pause it, stop it, or start it, you just issue the command again. One thing that confused me the very first time when I did in place is that I'm used to the classic reorg executing the command and then not coming back until it's done. Where I did my in place reorg and I hit go and my command line came right back. But it's running things in the background, so that makes sense. You have to go to a monitoring tool to see where it is. And in both cases, whether you're doing an offline or an online, you can see things in monitoring tools. Finally, if you're doing the in-place reorg, you are probably going to end up going back and doing a reorg for indexes. How do I monitor things? There are going to be some DBAs that are going to be screaming at the screen when I say I prefer Db2 PD. There are other ways to do this, but with Db2 PD, I get more out of it. First of all, it's going to tell you what's been done in the past, and it's going to tell you what the table names are. I had to redact quite a few of these for security reasons, but you can see that the YFS inventory audit table and the explain statement table, these have all been done, and it can tell you if it was online or offline and how I approached it. It'll tell you when I started and when I ended, but when I go over here, this is where I pay attention. It'll show me the phase that I'm in this case it's stopped. It may say truncate. It'll tell you what phase it's going into, and you can get a gauge of how far along it has come. Honestly, when I do something I know that may be long running, I throw this command into a script that executes every minute and greps out the table name just so I can see that table and how it's moving across, and I can gauge times. The other thing that I do is in another window, I start watching my locks. This is a little overkill, and I wouldn't normally do this unless you're dealing with a big table or a lot of moving things around. But if I throw up Db2 top and I go to the capital U option for locks, as locks come in and out, you can see what type of locks are there, specifically the X lock, and if it's causing any problems. The first time that I started to do an inline or an online reorg, I saw that X lock come up and I panicked. I thought that was a table lock. It's not. Notice the object type. It says extent movement, and the object name is internal extent movement. It's doing this behind the scenes, moving things around. It's not locking out a table so it can move things around. So if you see this X lock, don't panic. All right, I said monitor through Db2 PD, and there are a lot of databases screaming at your screen right now going, that's stupid, use Db2 top or Db2 list utilities. I use Db2 PD for my personal preference. I also know that IBM is trying to go away from Db2 top over the long run, so I'm leaning on Db2 PD. And IBM, if you are watching, please note that the DBAs will start to riot and storm the castle with pitchforks if you take Db2 top away from us. So that's your public service announcement, IBM. All right, let's go back. What happens if your reorg is aborted, your online reorg is aborted? So I need to tell Db2, hey, that reorg I had before, ignore it. Don't pick it up where you left off, start fresh. There's a tech note about this, and it will show you what file you need to delete where. So Db2 basically releases the work it was trying to do before and starts anew. Now there's a lot more to this tech note, so it's going to be a link in my show notes. Matter of fact, I'm not touching everything with reorgs. Did you get all that? Don't be overwhelmed. Don't be panicky. Don't be afraid of reorgs. That was never my intention. What I wanted to do was stop you from just typing a command and locking up a database because you are trying to hit a big table at one time. Reorgs are necessary. You have to do them for performance over time. It's a best practice. So use it. Just think it through. Look at the advantages and disadvantages. Now next week, I'm going to take a look at dealing with high watermarks and how to reclaim space after a reorg is done. This will be a good primer for it, but that'll show you how to do some cool stuff with it. Like, let's go back to the system admin and say, hey, I'm giving you 5 gigs of space back. I mean, what system administrator wouldn't like that? So I hope you enjoyed this. I'll talk to you later, and I'll see you at the next episode.